Hello and welcome back to the channel to another of my wonderful interviews. Today I'm going to be talking to Mark Horn from Peacekeepers. You may have seen him on the internet. We've been talking in the last few shows about common law, natural law, what is legal and what is lawful. Well, I know that Mark and his colleague are often in conversation on their YouTube channel talking about these very things and helping people deal with a number of legal situations that they get themselves into. And I thought it would be absolutely wonderful to talk to Mark and have him on the show. And I'm pleased to say he is here. Hello, Mark.
Hi, how are you, Richard? Lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've been enjoying your videos very much, where you talk to your colleague. I've forgotten his name, Brian. And but we often see Brian on the phone talking to enforcement agencies and things like that, and just showing how the system works and how little these guys actually know about the legal system that they're operating in themselves,
Correct.
which is just mind-boggling, because you assume that everybody would, if you're presenting a legal case, that they would know what the hell they're talking about.
You would, yeah. That, Richard, is actually the fundamental of the problem. Okay, the Queen promises, or the monarch promises, to govern the people using statutes and Parliament agreed, according to the people's respective laws and customs. We've got excellent law. The problem is we've become accustomed to tolerating lying politicians, lying media, trusting the legal professionals know what they're doing, trusting doctors know what they're doing, and the same. So, yeah, it's misplaced trust. That's the problem we face. And you're quite right. They are just really, the biggest problem is one of ignorance. We don't know our rights. They don't know what they're meant to be doing.
It's
And
chaotic, isn't it?
yeah, and the best description I found for it really is a bunch of headless chickens running around, hoping not to bump into one another and not hoping not to be tripped up by somebody before their next paycheck or their pension. And honestly, that's what's going on out there. Anybody that gives them more credit than that, I'm agree.
So let's start our conversation then, because there's a whole lot of, I suppose, misinformation or confusion perhaps about what is lawful and what is legal. And maybe you could help take me and the viewers through that somewhat choppy water.
Well, again, like I was saying earlier before we started recording, nothing new under the sun, okay? In the Act of Settlement 1700, it defines what the word law means in Section 4. Law is the birthright of the people. It's your birthright, my birthright, i.e. natural law, law of creation, God's law, universal law, whatever you want to call it. That's your birthright. So the Act of Settlement 1700 is a legislative confirmation of the definition of law. So wherever you read the word law in any piece of legislation, it means your birthright. And Section 4 continues because it says those governing must govern according to the same, i.e., those governing must govern according to your birthright, my birthright, which, guess what, is their birthright as well.
Yes.
And therefore, that brings up this whole nonsense of parliamentary sovereignty. Because when you need to understand the structure of authority. So if it's every person's birthright, that means every member of parliament's birthright is no different from yours or mine. These are what are called self-evident truths. Basically, unless somebody can bring creator, creation, again, whatever word you choose to use for it, into a court of law to give first-hand witness testimony, which is cross-examinable, that any individual or group of individuals, i.e. Parliament assembly, can impose their will on any individual or group of individuals. That creates the self-evident truths that nobody can impose their will on another. All are equal under the law, and nobody's above the law. And that's because the law is all of our birthright. And that's how simple it is. So That's what lawful means, anything which upholds your birthright. And like I say, in the act of settlement, all the successors are bound to uphold every individual's birthright. And that there is legislatively affirmed. Legislation is legal, the written form of the law. That there is what legal means, and lawful is every person's birthright.
So if you have the situation in which no man can order another man about unless he's agreed to do it,
Correct.
how is it that we have a situation in which the government is deciding to push forward a whole load of acts and statutes that people do not wish or have not agreed to?
Correct. So basically, again, we've got to go back to the Bill of Rights to see what authority does Parliament actually have.
Mm.
And if you look at any act of Parliament, and these are available on legislation.gov.uk, if you click under the Contents tab, the first thing you'll see with every act of Parliament is it has what's called an introductory text. That introductory text will tell you what's the authority, who created this, under what authority. And it says, be it enacted by the monarch, by and with the advice and consent, i.e. a meeting of the minds of the Lords Spiritual, Lords Temporal and Commons in this Parliament assembled by authority of the same. So what we have there is these words. We have a monarch, we have Lords Spiritual, we have Lords Temporal, and we have Commons. And it's on their own authority that they are creating this act. So to find out what those words mean, you need to go back to the first act of William and Mary. So the first act of William and Mary, what happened was a bunch of people, living people like you and me, sat down and said, what we're going to do is we are creating these fictions of law called the Lord Spiritual, which is basically the church, the representatives of the church, the Lord's Temple, which is the House of Lords, all the styles and titles which go with that, and the Commons is the MPs. And then together, you have the House of Lords, being the Lord Spiritual and Temporal, and the Commons, the House of Commons, who together create another fiction of law called Parliament. So that there's the creating authority, and they tell you in that document that they've done this because this is what we used to do. Except before, it was the monarch who had to start this process. However, the monarch at the time, James II or John II, whichever one it was, doesn't matter. He was running out of money to run wars, and so this group of people that created these fictions cut a deal with Richard and Mary, William and Mary of Orange, who came over the waters with their soldiers, and the king at the time said, well, I got no soldiers, so I'm buggering off out of it, fleeing for his life. And to make that there, in essence, is what they claimed their right then, is that the king had abandoned his property, i.e. the crown and the right to divine right of kings to govern. And therefore, the Bill of Rights, that is how they claimed that authority to create the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights itself, in its first sentence, expresses that Parliament is the representative of the people, i.e., we the people are sovereign over Parliament. In its first sentence, it tells you this. And then it goes on to say that royal prerogative is subject to Parliament. So we've got a very clear, simple structure there as to the chain of authority. People are sovereign. Parliament does what we tell it to do. And if it doesn't, then it's their own personal liability because they're acting without our authority. And through acts of parliament, they tell the government what to do. So acts of parliament are what's called primary legislation. And you can think about this really as a board of directors. We, the shareholders in the company, we employ the directors. The board of directors sits down and gives the broad brush as to where they want the company to go, the strategy, the big picture. And then they delegate to their managers to fill in the details. You know, what toilet paper you get or what disinfectant you use. You know, we don't want to be wasting our time as directors. So the way that happens is Parliament enacts primary legislation and delegates authority through secondary legislation, literally only to fill in the details. So whatever the government does is constrained by primary legislation, and primary legislation is constrained by the people. So how is this expressed? Basically, it's a contractual relationship. People are principal, Parliament is our agent, and our agent on our behalf offered the contract as expressed in the Bill of Rights to William and Mary, who accepted that contract on those terms and conditions. Therefore, the Bill of Rights defines the limits of what Parliament can and cannot do. And because the government's the agent, it defines the limits of what the government can and cannot do. So the first thing is it's a contractual relationship. Therefore, without consent, nothing can be done. And that is expressed and admitted by the mere fact of the Bill of Rights. So everything must be by consent. And again, the relationship is expressed in there, that nothing can be done to the prejudice of the people. When the monarch, William and Mary, accepted the crown and the royal prerogative, they accepted on the condition that everything expressed in there is for the people. It starts off with the claim that the members of Parliament are the representatives of the estates of the people. However, the acceptance of the contract changed that offer to be of the people. And like I say, then in 1700, because the monarch still didn't understand that they can't do what they want anymore, that Parliament itself expressly defined the law as the birthright of the people, and those governing must uphold our birthright. So this is the written constitution. That there is expressed, it's fact.
Right.
Sorry?
Well, I wanted to ask you some questions about all of that. On the one hand, so I've got three little questions that were occurring to me as you were talking there. First, if the people are the ones that have effectively got together and organised the fact that there is the Parliament and the royal prerogative, what's to stop the people deciding, do you know what, we're not happy with that anymore, we're going to start something completely different, whether it be a gaggle of elders or a witan or a different type of organisation to administer?
The Bill of Rights actually is the legal precedent which allows you to do that.
Right. So
the Bill of Rights is saying, it says in there, it's our ancient right and liberty
to do that.
And basically, what have they done in substance? They've removed the existing king who is tyrannical and replaced it with another one. Therefore, exactly like you say, you simply need the Bill of Rights, because that bears the precedent which says if those governing are no longer fit for purpose, just replace them.
Right. So I mean, I'm thinking in a huger way of, rather than just voting in another party, etc. The whole damn lot is a shambles, and you'd find a whole different way of organising us that would work for us. So my second question,
basically, okay, we need to understand it's always a problem about enforcement. Okay, they have the monopoly on the use of violence, and that is the only way it gains any legitimacy. Because if you don't do what they say, they will first try to talk to you nicely. If you still don't do what they say, then they'll scream and shout at you. If you still don't do what they say, they'll put you through the court system. And if you still don't do what they say, they'll use actual violence. Well, threats of violence first. We're going to take away your liberty. We're going to lock you up, stop you driving, or whatever it is. And eventually, it all stands on the threat and actual violence. That
Yes.
generates the fear in people.
Yes, so that they acquiesce,
Correct.
even though if everybody, again, it's that there's more of us than them. They are the tiny dot telling the throng and all of that. So my second question is, you mentioned about about fictions being created. And I wonder if you could explain what you mean by fiction, because people who are new to this will think, well, I thought it was a fact.
Yeah. Okay. The fact is, you are a being and I'm a being.
Yes.
But you, the being, associate with the title Richard.
Yes.
I'm the being associate with the title Mark. So Mark or Richard, the title or the style is a fiction.
Okay.
So going back, the monarch, the fiction of the monarch, is described in the Bill of Rights as the crown and the royal prerogative and the authorities that go with that position or the title. So that there's a simple way of explaining what a fiction is. So you've had real living people who sat around at Parliament and said, we are going to call ourselves the House of Lords, which includes the Lord Spiritual and the Lord's Temporal, and each living being of a Lord Spiritual or a Lord Temporal has a title or a style. And together that day, we're going to create this fiction, which we're going to call the House of Lords. Then we're going to have all of the living beings who we call members of Parliament or MPs, and they're going to have a different house, which we're going to call the House of Commons. So we've got these two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and together we're going to call that a different fiction, Parliament, when they're together. And then in the Bill of Rights, they create the fiction of the monarch. And when the monarch is together with Parliament, i.e. the House of Lords and the Commons, together they create another fiction called Parliament Assembled. So that there's the fictions there. But fictions, humanity wouldn't be able to interact without fictions of law, i.e. how does somebody, my word is my bond, but if we record that in writing, we need to associate with that. And so there's a massive debate about words. So the word person is where many, many people spend a lot of energy trying to argue, I'm not the person, I'm a living man, I'm a living woman. Okay. So with this living man or living woman, if you look at the Interpretations Act, so again, a legal definition, a legislative definition by Parliament, okay, you'll find in the Interpretations Act. And what it says is the word person means an individual or more than one individual, i.e. an unincorporated person, which means a natural person, a human being, a man, woman, child, whatever, or incorporated. So if we look now back at the definitions of Parliament and the monarch, Parliament is made up of two houses, and if we take the House of Lords, it's made up of the Lord's Spiritual and the Lord's Temporal and the Commons. So the House of Lords Spiritual and Temporal are made up of natural people, natural persons who have incorporated themselves into a body corporate, and that does not mean for profit private company, okay? It's a body corporate, you get many different types, known as the House of Lords. And equally, incorporated as the House of Commons. So Parliament is a person, a legal person, but it's a fiction of law because it's made up of living persons, natural people.
So can I just ask you a question there? Because if you're talking about definitions of words, and it seems to me that the law is very strict on definitions of law.
Yeah.
And I know from watching other videos and your videos and other people's videos that some words can have sort of a double meaning, as it were. But
Yeah.
going back to the person thing, it
Yeah.
strikes me that if you've got the potential of a definition for the word person to mean it's a legal fiction,
Yeah.
or it means you're a living man, surely it can't be both. Surely it can only be one or the other, because
Correct.
otherwise, on
Yeah.
paper,
Yeah.
how do you determine whether you're talking about a living being, as you said,
Yeah.
or a representation of you on paper that is your legal fiction?
Okay. Now, the rules of equity, okay, people call it equity law. It's actually not equity law. It's known as the rules of equity. And basically, that resolves this issue that you've just asked. Equity is about substance and not form. So it means, what is the intent or the context of the message that's trying to be relayed? So by way of an example, okay, if I get a speeding ticket and the claim is I've breached legislation, blah, 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 and I was driving at this place, and this is the car registration, etc. So equity resolves this, because you need to understand what is the claim about. It's a claim. It's not a play of words. The claim is, my mind was in control of my body, and I was in control of the thing which was traveling at this speed at that place at that time. That's the substance.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you want to call me all capital letters or small letters, or a big letter and small letters, or whatever, that's the form. But the substance is, I associate with that form. So if I'm the occupier of a house,
yes,
I'm the substance, the form is just the occupier. But equity prevails over the form. So I don't waste my time sitting and arguing, oh, my name should be big letters or small letters. Why? Equity stands above the common law. It's a higher...
So let me just ask you this then, to try and clarify that in my mind, because there's so much of this that can be muddling, and as you say, you know, people get very het up on certain things, and so I just want to try and clear myself. When a policeman says to you about a situation and then asks you if you understand, I've heard that actually means that you stand under my authority?
No. Again, utter nonsense. Okay. Now, the substance is, we speak a common language called English. And it's the reason, in a court, it would be down to a reasonable person's understanding. So literally, it's nothing more than English, O-level English. That's the language which prevails. So even with a person, somebody with O-level English knows it's a living human being. You can tell the difference between man and woman. So what you're talking about essentially are legal technicalities. Now that there is where the legal profession makes its money.
Right, right, okay.
We don't understand the rules of the game. Okay? And they don't tell us the rules of the game because they have a conflict of interest. If they told us the rules of the game, which are very simple and fair and just, any legal professional, so you're talking about solicitors, barristers, Queen's counsels, all of them are bound to, in society grants the privilege of being a legal professional. But there's a price that comes with that, the obligations for that benefit, which society gives you. And that is, first, you uphold the law. Secondly, you uphold the constitutional principle of the rule of law. Thirdly, you actually are an officer of the court. They don't work for you only. They work for the court. We just pay the bills. Then the obligations to the court include putting the court with all relevant law in favor and in dissent of their client's position. And then comes their client. Now, if they only did their job properly and fulfilled those obligations to us, society, who've granted them this special privilege, 90% of the cases would never even reach the courts. You don't need it. But that there's the conflict of interest. If they did their job properly, they wouldn't make money. That's what's meant to be policed.
Right.
Isn't.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're saying is that some of this legalese that you hear about, when people are talking to you, the double meaning, as it were, is not as binding.
It's not binding. For anything to be binding, there must be a meeting of the minds.
Right.
If there's not a meeting of the minds, it cannot be binding.
Okay.
Or when people use words like implied consent or acquiesce or all of this, if there's not a meeting of the minds, there can be no bond.
But how do you deal with them if you've gone to court, for example, which I know you're doing this, and you're arguing against a legal system that is pretty much set up against, because they seem to be a money-making machine.
Correct.
Interest. Yeah, and there's going to be a conflict of interest, and so they're going to use all these hidden techniques, such as things like what I've heard, the 12 presumptions that you are supposed to, that's assumed about you, and unless you rebut them, they'll use them, like trustees, whether you're a trustee, whether you're the executor, or the beneficiary. What do you think about those?
Okay, so I mean, this is very common. People are under the belief that they shouldn't pay for living, and I absolutely agree with that. Okay, and the reason is, and it's expressed in Genesis 1:26 to 1:28, I think, that actually expresses the trust. The Creator created all of this and granted us life and granted us, all the people, dominion over the land and everything else. What it didn't do, okay, is say who's the trustee. So what it says is we all are trustees of the land that we possess, and we have the beneficial right to the seasonal fruits, and we have the trustee obligation to future generations not to knowingly cause it harm, i.e. we must apply the best available knowledge at all times so that we don't wreck the place for future generations. So that's the trust relationship. So in law, there's something called trustee du son, which is a very well-established common law tort. So what should happen is those governing have two jobs. One is to uphold the rule of law, and the second is to make sure everybody gets a fair share of the Creator's pie. So in effect, what should happen when we die, we have no being. Whatever we've been entrusted with for future generations should return to society and get given to the most needy. And so that's the trust relationship. However, what's happened is through legislation, those governing have created privileges for certain people, which again is against their own legislation. The Statute of Monopolies 1623 says any grant of a privilege is unlawful.
Right.
Yet they continue doing this. So what they've done is through legislation and the common law over time, the government or the true intent of the trustee has failed. They should ensure everybody has a fair share of the pie. And what's happened is through privileges, which even legislatively is unlawful, they've granted certain privileges to certain people to benefit, i.e. self-interest. Now, Adam Smith in 1750 called this the invisible hand. The invisible hand is self-interest. So what happens is we all are entitled to seek shelter from the environment. Therefore, it's normal that the average person will have a home. It could be big or it could be small. But with that, then, it's a natural right. So going back to our definition of law at the beginning, our birthright, we all have the birthright of seeking shelter from the environment. Therefore, nobody has a right to remove that from us. But what they're doing is, when they're trespassing on our fair share of the pie, of the Creator's creations, they are trespassing upon a trust without authority of the Creator. Therefore, they become the trustee, whilst we are the beneficiary. So whenever they deny you a natural right, they are trustee de son, i.e. a trustee, and that creates an obligation for them to provide for you because they have denied you your right.
So if you've got the trust that is the natural laws trust, God's trust, whatever it is, presumably that's the person who makes the trust is the trustee because they've made it.
You don't have to know that you're in a trust.
Right.
Okay?
But who's going to administer the trust? Because when my dad died, he was still a legal person on paper, even though he was dead, in capital letters and all of those sort of things. And I became the executor of his whole estate, which was his trust. Yeah. So, and I was the sole beneficiary. Well, in fact, my sister and I were the sole beneficiary. It was down to us to administer his will and deal with the estate. So in that instance, we weren't the trustee because we didn't set it up. It was my dad, but he was dead, and we had a responsibility with the government, didn't we? Or the treasury.
No, you had an obligation from your dad.
Yeah.
Dad wrote down the law of that trust in his will.
But once he died, where did the trust go? Because we couldn't be all three members of a trust, could we?
You can't be trustee and beneficiary. However, whilst you're the trustee in the example that you pointed out, you are the trustee to uphold the law of the trust which your dad set out. And that law said, okay, you're going to split up my estate in the following manner as a trustee. Once that was done, so you had a beneficial interest in the estate.
Yeah.
However, that was converted then into a legal interest once you'd executed your role of trustee. So
is the trustee and the executor one and the same?
Yeah, the executor is the trustee, correct.
Right, okay.
But basically, once you'd finished your obligations as executor, you then became the beneficiary. So you're only fulfilling one box at a time, one corner of the triangle at a time.
Right. So I think we've sort of covered that bit. The bit that then I wanted to get onto was you were talking about people having their homes, and that's a natural right, and that seems very fair to anybody that we should have shelter.
Yeah.
But the fact that in order to do that in our modern day, we then have to pay by default for services that we've not necessarily asked for. And we're coming up to the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, where we get that very foolish bill from a corporation that just asks for some money for something we've not asked for. Now, if I wanted to say, look, do you know what? I can take my rubbish down to the amenity tip myself. Right. If I'm ill, I can take myself to hospital. It's only around the corner from where I live. I don't really need a light outside because I can put a lantern up. Yeah. We're being asked to pay by an organisation for services that we've not really agreed to. And we can't do anything we can't move our house. We can only move ourselves from the house. Yeah. And wherever we go, we're still going to get a bill through the land. How is that right or fair? on the basis that we should be allowed to have shelter, and then we still have to pay somehow.
Correct. This is exactly what the point we've started last April Fool's Day, the knock knock challenge,
Right.
obligation challenge, prove my obligation. So essentially, again, back to the basics of, unless you can bring the creator here to say that one person can impose their will on the other, there must be consent. So they're operating on, in effect, custom or unwritten constitution. So the first thing with an unwritten constitution, again, if we look at law, okay, bring whoever wrote this unwritten constitution, which doesn't exist, into a court to give first-hand testimony that is cross-examinable, that it actually exists. Doesn't exist. That's why they call it the unwritten constitution.
Right.
Okay? And so what they do is basically, the unwritten constitution says Parliament is sovereign. Okay, and so if we look at that, like I've said, where's the authority from Parliament come from? And legislation, simply it's self-declared by a bunch of people. We could do this, anybody can do this. And it ultimately comes back down to the violence, okay, the threats of violence. And if you don't do as we demand, because it's not a council tax bill, it's a council tax demand.
Yes.
Okay, so sorry, just because you demand something, why must I comply? I don't see where this is. And so coincidentally, April Fool's Day this year, we're starting the next phase of it, because it's about planting these questions in the consciousness of people. Like you asked, why must I do what you say? What gives you the right to force me to give you money? This is in breach of your own slavery legislation. So what we're doing is, I'll just give you a quick briefing here.
Please do.
We're putting up a pledge site where people can, if they can prove the obligation, i.e., where's the joinder, where is my obligation created, then you can have all the money. So the idea there is that if we get tens of thousands of people just pledging a $5 each, all of a sudden you got a nice little lottery to answer one simple question: where's my obligation?
Yes.
Because we've been through the councils, we've been through solicitors, we've been through barristers, we've been through the courts, we've been through everywhere. And to date, nobody has shown an obligation. So now we're going to make the big prize. We're going to get people to toss in a $5, and if it's so simple, just show it to us.
Yes, it should be easy for them.
Exactly. If Parliament thinks they can show us the obligation, show us and take the money.
God has written it down on a bit of paper. Maybe Moses will come back from the dead and bring it, parting the seas and go, I've got the obligation.
Yeah, show it to me.
Show it. So that's what we want. So, I mean, the thing is, the services are useful that a council provide.
And what I'm doing is not about not contributing to society.
Exactly. So if you could negotiate, if the council said, here is a menu of services, what would you like? And here are the prices, or what can you pay according to your standing in the world. Exactly. And you said, actually, I'd like to contribute this for the bins. I'm not so much worried about the lighting, let my house burn down, I'm well insured, or whatever it is. Then you'd have a system that people would be very happy with, because they feel they're contributing. That it's nice to have the roads tarmacked,
but accountability.
And that, it seems, a fair system for everybody, and that's all good. And if you're very poor and you can't, you can say, look, this is what I can afford.
Correct.
And it seems a very just obvious.
It's a no-brainer.
Yeah, a no-brainer. And no one would be feeling under stress, under pressure. Now, I've been when I was about 20 years ago, I had the bailiffs. I was in the town council with the children, pleading them not to do the... what do they call it? The things they put on your
kick you out.
Yeah, whatever it was, I've gone through all that, so I know the stress and the worry and what it does to your marriage and your health and all of that, and bringing up children. And it just seems that's not what life should be about. We're all supposed to be here, or we should be here to get as much out of life as much as possible, because we're here for such a limited time.
Absolutely.
So now there's a YouTube person that a lot of people will know called the Black Belt Barrister.
Our friends, BBB.
So now I watched him last night knowing I was going to be talking to you, and he had one in which he showed a clip, not from you, but from Gavin from Sovereign Empowerment or whatever it is.
Because that's because, you know, he won't, we've invited him to have a live debate, but he won't debate.
He won't. But his point was, this is law or legal law, and it's an obligation. You've got to play it, and don't believe anybody else that says you otherwise.
Sure.
And of course, you know, it's there to frighten you. But then he's a barrister, so he would say that, wouldn't he? Comes to mind.
No, absolutely. And now the thing is, what's so irrational about Black Belt Barrister is we've actually provided, what he's saying is it's a legal obligation under the Local Government Finance Act 1992. So what we're saying is, well, how can that be lawful? Because another one of your pieces of legislation which you rely on, you telling me legislation is law, that actually defines law as my birthright. And the Bill of Rights creates the authority and the obligation of those governing to uphold my birthright. Now, if my birthright is I'm entitled to shelter from the environment, you can't
yes
all that. So even using their own things, okay, and that there's using legislation. He's using legislation to say we must, and we're saying with legislation, hang on, are you sure about that? And so you can see their irrationality. And I think there is honestly some Matthias Desmet or that. He put out this thing of cognitive dissonance, the mass psychosis, I think he called it. There is a comprehension problem here because they can only read and understand this piece of paper, yet another piece of legislation. They're relying on legislation and they can't even see the existence of another piece of paper and see how the two interlink. They are so in a box. They have no idea what's going on in the box next door. And nobody's stepping back to see how do all these little boxes fit together. Everybody's doing their own thing. They had this chicken and hoping that they get away with it. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing. Now, I don't want to say any more about Black Belt Barrister because he's just one of those that's put his head over the parapet and is alerting people to legal problems and things. And so on that. But I imagine for people within the legal profession, just generally, there is a vested interest, of course, to keep and perpetuate these type of things because they're earning a lot of money, and if what you're proposing with the £5 thing goes through, and suddenly you go, oh, actually, the council tax withers on the vine because they can't show the obligation, but it becomes something better for people, like we were saying, a negotiated contract that you can say, well, I'd like to do this, or maybe you could do that, which would be so much happier for everyone, and everyone would just get on so much easier. So I think there are vested interests, but maybe those vested interests would, if they were to, as you say, look to the legislation themselves and see that there are two bits of the legislation which
something take priority.
It's a nightmare. So, Mark, I mean, this is an engrossing subject. How long have you been looking at this and going into it?
Okay, I mean, my background is contract law, so I've been in contract law for a long time, settling contract claims and so forth, and so that, like I say, more than 30 years I've been at that, and then about 10 years ago I started looking at just fundamental principles of truth, i.e., what does legal mean and what does lawful mean. And so using first principles, I came to the conclusions that I have. Then I next went through the Bible to get all the biblical references of the fundamental truths. And then from that, then COVID came along. And with that, it became clear that this is just utter irrationality. I mean, it's just nonsense. So with that, then I really went into, more. I'd already done a lot of research in this stuff. But then I really got into the legislation and came back to the UK. Before that, in 2018, I had a case where basically a developer went bust and thought it's okay to run away with £50,000.
Oh, right.
And that's where I learned about equity. In the Senior Courts Act, Section 49, it tells you the rules of equity prevail over the common law, i.e., why do I want to waste my time in common law? Equity is where the solution lies. So with that, then I really got into equity and trust law. And then with CV, the whole thing about we've got to do something about this, because this is no way to continue society. So I put together a claim I was going to lay against Parliament, was involved with Michael Benicia in the first private criminal prosecution of Matt Hancock, which actually was a success because it confirmed the process.
Wow, okay.
And that there reaffirms the power of one. Each individual has the power to take even a standing minister into court for criminal charges. So that was absolutely confirmed. And then I thought, hang on, to change this, we need to change the consciousness. We need to get people to understand what is actually going on. And that's very much where I've been concentrating this. We're not only doing the research and developing the Peacekeeper website with educational materials. All the courses are free. Everything is free. It just works on donations. And then with the knock-knock challenge, the council tax challenge last year, it's to put this into the consciousness, to plant the seeds, to start the ripple effect. So we started with the councils. So we had interactions with a large number of councils, of which one actually constructively engaged, but basically was backed into a corner then. He knew it, we know it. And said, sorry, I can't do anything else. Okay, I can't correspond anymore. So we've had the most absurd opinions from the legal profession, from the councils, from everybody. And they all simply revert back to, after 1 year, Parliament is sovereign. It'll tell you what to do and take from you what it wants. So to change this, we need to put it into the consciousness of what is truth. Truth is no one can tell anybody else what to do. So we've started with the councils, and again, we're going to be stepping up that campaign this year because we're creating an automated system for people to do notices. And then that is moved into the courts. And so in the courts, it's going into the consciousness. And you can see, when you go into court, you know within minutes whether you're going to be heard or not. So in Westminster, it was clear within about 15 seconds of the judge walking in that he's been instructed or he's going to shut this down. Whereas other times, you actually can see that one or two of the magistrates is actually listening and getting into their, questioning it, as are the clerk of the courts, or sometimes the judge, or not, or what. But it starts with one, because they are all talking about what we're doing. It's really simple, what we're doing, prove my obligation. And so they coming together with a strategy The only way that they can keep it going, this system, is through increasing the enforcement, i.e. the threats of violence and actual violence. However, the important thing is it's in the consciousness. Once it's in your subconscious, then it starts to play with your, head and heart.
Because there must be a moral. I mean, even the judges or the conveners, whatever they are, who bring the courts together, and all those real people within that legal fiction who are acting this out in theatre, as it were. They must have a moral sense that actually, a lot of what you're saying, if not all of what you're saying, makes sense for a cohesive, wholesome life. And why you would want to suddenly go, hang on, we'll just penalise these people. And it seems the whole of the legal profession is there to extract money, particularly from people who don't have a lot of money, which is
they go for the easy targets.
Yeah, and yet how do they live with themselves, for one thing? But don't they take oaths that they're supposed to uphold the law, and that's part of their oath?
Correct. Now, this is one message that we're trying to get across to people. Okay, I wasn't around in 1688 with the Bill of Rights.
You weren't?
I wasn't around in 1215 with the creation of Magna Carta.
Sometimes I feel like I have been.
Or not that I can recall anyway.
No.
But in essence, okay, if I wasn't around, what's it got to do with me? Nothing. I haven't advised, I haven't consented. Any legislation's got, before 64 plus 18, whatever that is, 72, cannot legally have anything over them. And so the way that governance actually works is through contract. And the contract is the oath, affirmation, or attestation of the officers of those governed. That includes Parliament. Parliament also makes an oath. Okay? So that starts with the first and second promises in the Coronation Oath Act 1688. Now, that there is actually a part of the Bill of Rights. Those two together are the constituting authority of those governing today. And the monarch promises to govern the people using statutes and Parliament agreed on, i.e. what we said earlier, that Parliament tells them what to do, and the laws and customs of the same. Now, of this, the laws and customs of the same can only be those of the people. It's not the laws and customs of Parliament. Okay, and as we've said, that there's the birthright. So that there's where governance starts. So basically, the contract to govern is the monarch is the head trustee. And they then delegate through oaths of allegiance and oaths of office. All the people are bound by the same contract, bound by the same law. And again, the law is confirmed as your birthright in the Act of Settlement 1700. So then the second promise is the contract for the independent judiciary. So what you've got is the Bill of Rights sets out that the independent legislature body is Parliament assembled. The first promise creates the independent government. And the second promise creates the third pillar of the separation of powers, the independent judiciary. And that says, according to law, blah, blah, blah. Again, the oaths, affirmations, and attestations are delegated to the people that are implementing them, and it ends up with the police oath, affirmation, or attestation. The oath and the police oath, affirmation, or attestation is very simple in substance. To keep the peace. What are you talking about? Let's live in peace and harmony. Protect people and their property according to law. That's the contract. So those are the contracts. Why? In the Oath Act 1978, it says an oath is what binds you. That's what creates duties, rights, and obligations. So they are getting paid from the public purse. That's the consideration for them upholding their oaths, affirmations, or attestations, which all are to law and the law is our birthright. That's what they're meant to be doing. That's how simple the system should be.
Is
But
it
because of
is
the
it
self-interest.
is it true that, that within the legal profession, particularly, you know, the sort of Roman bar legal profession, then that you've got two oaths being said, one to the people, and one to the sort of secret oath to the bar to uphold all of that for the legal fiction? Is that
Yeah.
how does that work?
So let's go back again to basic principles. If there is some oath to some little society, it's got nothing to do with me. What they've made as a public oath to me, that's what binds us.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So what they do in private, your house is your home. Do in there what you want.
Yes.
Okay. But it's got nothing to do with me. Contractually, it can't have anything to do with me. It's well-established contract law. Where there's not a meeting of the minds, there is no bond.
Yeah. So it's all null and void.
Null and void. I mean, like I say, I've been down all of these rabbit.
I'm absolutely sure.
Different picture.
I'm sure we could talk for ages, but we've been going for about 56 minutes, so I better wind it up. It's a fascinating topic, and as you say, there are so many little rabbit holes and so many variations and all of that, but I hope for the viewer that it's given them an insight to the type of work that you're doing and the kind of brain dancing that you have to do, because you've been doing it for a long time. So if people are, and I'm sure they are, interested in what you're doing, particularly with the knock knock challenge, did you call it?
That's right.
As people, I think more and more now since the pandemic, have become to wake up to a number of their rights. And of course we've seen Parliament pushing a whole load of things upon us that nobody's asked for. And that people are thinking, hang on, how do we push back against all of this and hold them to those original oaths of looking after us? They can get in touch with you at peacekeepers.org, is that correct?
Peacekeepers.org.uk.
.uk. I will put that in the thing.
Yeah, and it's free, free, everything's for free, and we've put in an infrastructure so that as we're building the numbers, local groups are starting to form, and just sign up and find some people, go through, discuss it. If you've got any questions, everything on the website's open to questions, comments, because to me it's about the search of truth.
And are you finding at the moment that this is like never before? People are interested.
Gaining traction, and the main thing is I'm looking at it from a different viewpoint. Lots of people have talked about the legal fiction for decades. Okay, and it doesn't resonate as truth to me. Whereas what I'm showing you is this is my truth, and here's why I believe it. I don't expect you to do your research. I expect you to challenge me on my belief. So everything is resourced and linked back to an authoritative source. It's not my opinion. This is why I believe what I believe. And if you think I'm wrong, please show me I'm wrong, because if I'm wrong, what I'm doing is not helping people.
Right. The principle of science and all of that, and we've seen how misuse of science is.
It's the scientific method I'm applying, not peer-reviewed science. Two very different things.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen how that can be misused.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, God. Mark, it's been an absolute joy to talk to you and go and shuffle around on this subject. It's been really good.
It's been wonderful. Thanks for having me, Richard.
No, it's my pleasure. And I shall be following and no doubt getting in touch personally as well as the April Fool's Day approaches. Mark, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I hope it's been of use to the lovely viewer. Do check it out. I'll put the links in the description, as well as the YouTube channel, which is a hoot, especially when Brian is on the phone to the conversation. Just how ignorant people are is who are enforcing the laws, and they just have no idea.
There's the real problem. Mass ignorance.
Yeah. and they just don't know what to do.
Yeah.
It is hilarious. So even just on an entertainment basis, it's fun. But you're doing great work. Thank you so much, Mark.
It's my pleasure.
Do join me again, ladies and gentlemen, for another interview coming up very soon. But until then, from Mark and I, goodbye.